So the first question, of course, when we do pricing is, what is your product worth? Or anybody's product worth? And the worth of a product is not, in and of itself, is not a measurable, tangible thing. Alex Rodriguez worth $250 million. Those of you who don't know who Alex Rodriguez is are going like, who is that? Baseball player. Is Instagram worth $1 billion? Right? What's the answer? So what is a product or a company or a service or a technology worth? Was Motorola Mobile worth $12 billion? Well, somebody paid that money, whether it was the New York Yankees or Facebook or Google. Somebody paid that money. So what is anything worth, right? In the market, that is. So this is the example of a product called MySQL, which the company got acquired by Sun, and then Sun got acquired by Oracle, so now MySQL is owned by Oracle. And MySQL was a free relational database. Now, if it's free, why are there users paying for a free product? Right? $5.95, $19.95, $49.95, or even better, call. What does call mean? Talk to me to see what it's worth. That's what it is, right? So how do you find out? It of course depends on who you ask. At this point, it should become very clear that the targeting and the segmentation exercises are the basis of finding out what the pricing exercise should be, right? So it depends on who you ask. So in this case, in the case of MySQL, certain products are worth $0. And there were millions of downloads of MySQL. It was one of the most, or it is, it's still in the market, important relational databases in history. But then, medium businesses, enterprises, and so on and so forth would rather pay rather than have the free product. So there's a saying, you can't beat free. It's not true. Clearly, you can beat free. Clearly, you can charge for things that are otherwise available for free. Okay? So it not only depends on who you ask, but also it depends on what they're using this for. Okay? So the usage of something is as important as who is going to use it. So let me start with that. The pricing is one of the most important exercises in strategy. And value. So I'm going to keep coming back to value. Price is an expression of value. And of course, where does value reside? In the customer. So value is not in the product. Value resides in the customer. What resides in the product? Features. Thank you. Okay? Technology resides in the product. Features reside in the product. Value resides in the customer. Okay? Ergo, price depends on the specific customer. So you know where I'm going, right? The more, if you want to maximize margins, if you want to maximize price, you should price according to each customer segment. So you can have the same core product, not whole product, the same core product, and you can wrap a different whole product and price it differently for each customer segment. So the more you segment, the more value you can capture. Now there's a limit to this. Airlines segment by specific individual customers and by time. So there is a limit to the segmentation exercise. You should not infinitely segment, but in general, the more you segment, the more value you can capture. And remember that each one of these customer segments may or will have a different whole product. Okay, so back to MySQL. Here's how they priced. Here's how each one of these products became a different whole product. Folks who did not care about schema advisors, folks who did not care about security, folks who did not care about replication, things like that, were not willing to pay any money. But folks who care about these things were actually buying not just the same relational database, but a different whole product. Does that make sense? And the only way for you to find out, this is not about throwing features at the core product, it's about feeling the pain. What is important to you? Okay? So if you call someone who has SAP, ERP, and tell them what are you willing to pay and what's important to you, they're going to give you another answer. To them, all these things are important, replication and performance and all that. But what else would be important? What else would be important for Wall Street, for instance? Uptime. They want to be up 99.99999% of the time, because one transaction that's lost may be millions of dollars. So they would be willing to pay much more for that. Does that make sense? So the same core product could be worth different, could have different values for different buyers. So let me give you a couple of tools, and then I'll come back to different pricing strategies. The first one is called economic value to the customer, EVC. And if you get nothing else from this pricing exercise, EVC is the thing to get. The other one is switching costs. I talked about this a couple of weeks ago, but I want to reinforce the concept of switching costs, because switching costs are real. Most users are going to be switching from something to your product, whether it's from a PC to a product, from one software to another, and so on and so forth. So you need to analyze what it's going to cost them to switch. And then I'm going to talk about two different types of pricing strategies, skimming versus penetration. And also I'm going to overlay this with a global perspective. And this is going to be important for the case that we're going to have next week, because that company is, a European company, and we want to explore, when they come to the US, how are they going to price that product? It's a new product and it's a new market. So what should be a pricing strategy on a global level? Okay, so in general, there are 4 factors that affect pricing. And if you start from the bottom, it's going to cost you. So cost of goods sold you should know what they are. What does it cost you to produce that product or that service? Hopefully you're going to sell above cost of goods sold, otherwise you don't have a business. Not long term, unless, of course, you're going to be acquired by Facebook. But even then, you don't know who is going to acquire you, right? So you better have a sustainable business model. 2, competition. If there's a lot of competition, now, when I talk about competition, more than anything, I want to talk about competition in your markets. And again, that's why segmentation and targeting is so important, because it should be about competition in your specific target market. And of course, if there is competition, that basically is going to have You can't price it too high or too low, not too far below, not too far above the competition. So that creates certain boundaries. And then, of course, the upper boundary is customer value. And we're going to see economic value to the customer to see what the upper boundary of pricing is going to be. Okay. The other thing that's important is, of course, switching costs. And those of you who are, of course, in clean tech, as well as healthcare and such industries, government policy is huge in these markets. And they also help to determine what pricing is going to be, one way or another. The regulatory environment. And those of you who are in clean energy and clean transportation, finance is a huge thing, huge, okay? So finance should pretty much always be part of your offering. And the reason for that is that capital costs of a lot of clean energy and clean transportation products are higher, but of course, long term, it's much cheaper to maintain and operate. Additional factors to consider: ethics. I mean, should you price as much as you possibly can under all circumstances? That's not just a matter of strategy, but it's also a matter of ethics. We're not necessarily going to cover that in the class, although by the end of the case next week, we should talk about it a little bit. Okay, so back to value. Since value resides in the customer, what are the sources of value, by and large? So the number one source of value in business environments is financial/economic. And that basically translates into one of two things. You either increase revenues or decrease costs. You're going to do one or the other. So if you're saying I'm going to increase productivity, then I want to see what that means. Now, productivity means, again, one of two things: increase revenue, cut costs. Does that make sense? So if we're going to we're going to calculate the value to a customer, financially/economic, it's going to be one of those two things. Okay? Emotional, yes.
Tony, are these mutually exclusive necessarily?
What?
Increase revenue and cut costs?
So the question is, are they mutually exclusive? Absolutely not. There might be products that do both, that help you increase revenues and decrease costs. So if you have such a product, usually it's either or, you better back up your claim, because a lot of people claim that, but in fact it's not true. In fact, most times it's going to be one or the other. Products that quote unquote increase productivity usually have the claim that they increase revenue and cut costs, right? But you better be able to do the numbers, right? Another big source of value, especially in consumer markets, is emotional. Okay? People pay a lot for, dreams, aspirations, or, does anyone think that diamonds actually cost what they sell for, right? I mean, that's 90%, I'm just saying 90%, it's probably more, emotional value, right? Beauty, people pay a lot for that, whether it's cosmetics, whether it's surgery, whatever. I mean, people pay a lot for those emotional values. Social, the feeling that you're in a crowd, that you're part of the in crowd or whatever, is worth a lot. If not, ask Facebook, right? Or Twitter. Health, of course, is survival is worth a ton, and we're willing to pay basically anything for healthcare, or almost anything, right? Whether it's security or safety or health, all these things have a value. Regulatory value. So a lot of things have regulations behind them, and it's worth a lot for companies and people to pay to comply with those regulations. Whether it's HIPAA in healthcare, whether it's the CAFE standard, the carbon greenhouse targets, or whatever it is, right? Pollution, clean water, all those things. A lot of companies pay a lot of money to comply with regulation. So that's another source of value. Now, these are not mutually exclusive. A lot of products have a combination of values, and it's up to you to figure them out. And they're not obvious, especially in new markets. So you need to do your homework in the feel the pain exercise to see where the sources of value would be. EVs or LinkedIn have both financial and emotional value attached to them. Solar cogeneration for industry, for instance. If you're in the food business, you need to generate both hot water and power. Frito-Lay, for instance. So solar cogeneration, it has financial, it has emotional, and it also has compliance value, especially in states like California. So it could be a combination of these values, and it's up to you to figure it out. Now, let me talk about switching costs. Any questions so far? Switching costs. Switching costs make it risky or costly for users to switch to new or competing offerings. So every time that you ask a customer to swap out of whatever it is that they're using, from Windows to Mac, from internal combustion engine vehicle to an electric vehicle, from conventional lighting to LED lighting, whatever, they're taking a risk, or at least they feel they are. Okay, so this is a switching cost. And in general, technology users invest not just in your specific product, but they invest in complementary assets. Now, this is both the whole product, which, of course, as we know, is a combination of hardware, software, and services and technology, but also they invest in specific skills, in processes, in knowledge generation, and so on, that are specific to those technologies. And I'll give you examples. So especially when you are asking the customers to swap out of something, you should take into account all of these things. Okay? Especially software infrastructure. Ask somebody to swap out of, say, SAP, ERP, and they'll say, I don't think so. In fact, I have talked to SAP customers who would not upgrade to the next version because that might disrupt their business. Period. I spoke once to the CIO of a large multinational company who told me, we pay SAP something like $30 million a year to maintain this old version of R3 or whatever, so that we don't have to upgrade. Does that make sense? I mean, this is a big switching cost. Now, it's not the case in everything, but that's an example of, good luck trying to get that customer to swap out of that infrastructure. So, some switching costs, in fact, tend to rise over time. Databases, for instance, that's why Oracle is such a cash machine. Once you get one of those databases, good luck getting out. Because the more data you put in, the more programs you put in, it's just impossible to get out. Okay? And you have to keep buying it and keep buying it pretty much forever. Skills, specialized skills, specialized processes, all these things mean that you keep investing in those assets, and the cost to swap out of it tend to rise over time. Legal costs, business continuity costs, all these things cost money. And so you should know those things. And those of us who are in clean technologies, don't we know it? I mean, it's a huge hurdle to get folks to swap out, which we will over the next few years, of an infrastructure that is centralized, with big power plants out there and dumb users in here. We're swapping that infrastructure to one in which everyone is going to be generating and storing and using their own energy. I mean, that is not just swapping out of an infrastructure, but it's a whole different architecture. And it's going to take time, but that's basically what's happening, right? And that's why a lot of old utilities don't like the idea of residential solar. They just don't, right? Because it changes the whole architecture. Lock-in, this is an important concept. Lock-in happens when switching costs are so high, they become quote-unquote substantial. Substantial changes, of course, depending on what the product is, what the infrastructure is. What does it cost somebody to swap out of an Oracle database? What does it cost, like I said, a country to swap out of the fossil fuel infrastructure, the nuclear infrastructure, for instance? It costs money. Japan just shut down its last nuclear reactor, yay. But look at the costs of the Fukushima Daiichi disaster. And they may reopen them, right? Which shows you what, basically the specialized skills and the specialized processes and knowledge can do, right? Question?
What are the opportunities for solar in Japan now in view of the nuclear power plants getting shut off?
What are the possibilities of solar? Huge, right? Huge. But that's not, it's not part of this. Japan is one of the big growth markets right now in solar. Huge. In fact, a lot of companies are themselves putting up solar power plants despite government regulations and opposition and whatever, right? Because it's happening. It's they see the light, in other words, right? Thanks for that question. And infrastructure investments. The bigger the infrastructure, the more painful it is to switch. Whether it's transmission lines or whatever. And so collective lock-in has different levels. So you can be collectively locked into a technology. Say it's the collective lock-in is the combined switching cost of all users. Could be all users in a certain industry, for instance. If you are in the electronic distribution industry, you got to do EDI, right? And swapping out of EDI has been hard. If you're within a corporation, basically many corporations say you're either Mac or Windows. Okay, now the big wave of Windows and iPad and so on over the last few years has meant that they have to bend those rules, but it hasn't been easy for Apple. In fact, in the 90s, as some of you know, Apple almost went bankrupt because corporations were locking them out. They were saying, we're a Windows company, and all our infrastructure is going to be Windows. At the societal level, we are either 110 in electricity or 220, 240. You can't do both. It's very hard, right? And like I said, there are some countries that have areas that are 220 and other areas that are 110 because they can't swap out, right? It's very hard. The keyboard that we use. Does anyone know the history of the QWERTY keyboard? No? No one? So, back in the old days of typewriters, basically typewriters used to jam. Typewriters used to do this, right? And they would jam if somebody would write too fast. So in fact, somebody designed the slowest keyboard possible, okay, so that the typewriters would not jam, and because the whole society adopted this keyboard, it's called QWERTY because if you look at it, it's QWERTY. This is the slowest possible keyboard, and that's why we get carpal tunnel syndrome, because it's it was designed to be slow. Now, we have folks who have designed fast keyboards, right? Now typewriters don't even exist, okay? And we're still using that QWERTY keyboard because as a society, we're locked in. Does that make sense? So try the Dvorak keyboard, for instance, which is a very, very fast keyboard. So the question is, why don't we use it? Why doesn't Cisco use it? They have 200,000 people using these slow keyboards. Why don't they use it? Or Intel, or Apple, right? You can actually buy one of these keyboards for $20. Isn't that interesting? That is the concept of collective lock-in. We're locked in. We're locked into a stupid design, right? Or at least into an obsolete design because we all adopted it, right? So this is basically what I said. Because of these collective lock-ins, we are in many industries, power, electric vehicles, and so on, and the laws, which is something that people don't look at. Laws and regulations are written by the incumbents for the incumbents. Energy laws have been written for 100 years by the fossil fuel industry and the nuclear power industry for the fossil fuel industry. Okay? So when we aim to replace that infrastructure, it's not just a technology thing, it's a switching cost thing, it's a law thing, it's a regulatory thing. Does that make sense? And that's why it's so hard, even when the technology and the cost make sense. Okay, questions? So how do you calculate these switching costs? Well, you have to do the numbers. Basically you have to calculate switching costs for your product. I'll give you an example. But, take into account everything. Training your engineers, train the users in new interfaces, train in new processes, the learning curve. How long is it going to take for users to be up to 100%? How long and how much time and how much money is it going to take to transfer data from the old format to the new format? And not all of these things are applicable to all products, but these are examples of the kinds of things that you should be looking at. New application interfaces. And, people write software and hardware and whatnot to interface with old standards and interfaces. If you introduce a new API, then it's going to take money and time and engineering and all that to get going into that new infrastructure, API. Downtime due to business disruption, and this is huge, for large businesses. And I think Have I talked about the problem with Nike? No. So Nike basically adopted a new ERP in the early 2000s, basically supply chain infrastructure. And I think that they paid like $100 million or something like that for a brand new supply chain infrastructure, in software, hardware, everything. As soon as they launched it, basically shoes started being exported back from, Seattle back to Indonesia, where they were being made, instead of from Indonesia to the US. And so it was a major disaster, right? Nike lost 20% of their market cap in the subsequent weeks and months. So not only did they lose the $100 million in this ERP infrastructure, they lost money, they lost 20% of their market cap, and so on and so forth. That is what CIOs fear when basically they're going to, or you ask them to swap out of their infrastructure. Does that make sense? Okay. Now, just as an exercise, thought exercise, how high are switching costs to move, for instance, from AT&T to Verizon? Anyone? Has anyone swapped from AT&T to Verizon lately? You have?
Yep.
How painful was that?
It wasn't that painful because when I was on AT&T, I lost 2 job interviews on the phone because there was no reception on second and market. I was on phone interview,
Right.
job interview, and I lost 2.
Really?
And then I went immediately to the AT&T and I said I need to cancel the contract. And then they asked me why. I said because I lost 2 job interviews. And they were like, "Can we do something for you?" I said,
No, give me a job, right?
So
Yeah.
I went across the street literally. They have a Verizon right opposite.
Right,
of them.
right.
And they have a wonderful manager who remember every single thing of everything I need.
Yeah.
He will even call me when there's a new phone features, and he will give me everything that I asked for.
Yeah.
So ever since I've been a very happy Verizon customer.
Thank you. Did you all hear that? So
Painful as the customer.
it was
Very
painful.
tough.
It was painful. So that thanks for that, because
But the switch wasn't painful, the cause of the switch was painful, right? I mean, the process itself wasn't that painful.
so actually that was the answer to 2 questions. So I love that answer, because what it said, what you told me was that on one level, the actual swapping of one carrier to another was not that painful, but even if it had been, right? When do you actually say, I don't care what the cost is, the pain of staying with this company is so high that the pain of switching cannot be that bad compared to it. Does that make sense? That's why I switched from Windows to Mac. Because my Windows machine, I was writing a book, and it was crashing twice a day. I'm like you, I was losing, my business. I said, I don't care, what it cost me. I'm going to buy a Mac, and I'm going to just swap everything, all my software and whatnot. So the pain of being with Windows was much higher than the potential pain of swapping to Mac. Does this make sense? And that is true of a lot of products and services. Does that make sense? Okay, thank you for that. So let me talk about economic value to the customer. Did you have a comment? No, okay. So EVC, economic value to the customer. This measures the value captured by a specific customer for a specific product. Okay, I'm going to give you an example in a few. So there is no blanket EVC. It's a specific product and a specific usage situation. Okay. So just to remind you what we talked about before, there's a difference between value capture and value creation. Right? Remember that? Okay. So the price that a customer will pay is a subset of the value received by that customer. So you got to create the value. The customer is going to receive some of that value, and the price is going to be a subset of that value. Okay? Now, like I said a couple of minutes ago, in business, much of the EVC comes from financial/economic gains. In consumer markets, emotional sources of value are huge. The trick is going to be, how do you measure those emotional sources of value? But you have to do that. So in general, I'll give you the easy and quick formula. EVC is equal to increase of revenue plus cost savings. So anything, if you increase the revenue, that's value that you're adding to the customer. If you decrease the cost, that's value that you're adding to the customer. Minus switching costs. And that's why I talked about switching costs. You have to figure out what those costs are and basically take it out of the other potential value. Plus emotional value. Okay? Now, and this is important, like I said, in consumer markets. Let me give you an example. You have a company. You're the president, founder, product manager, and basically as a founder, you're the janitor of a company called Me Cleaner Water. And you've developed a water filtration product that is functionally identical to the competition. And their name is Clean Enough Water, Inc. Functionally identical means that they take the same input, which is textile, industrial wastewater, and they produce the same output, okay? Which is water that's 99.94% free of these specific pollutants, heavy metals, dyes, chlorine, and silica, okay? They may do it in different ways, but in the end, they produce the same output. Does that, so far so good? Now, here's some data on the competition's product. Their super filter costs $1 million to purchase. Customizing systems integration and setup costs $1 million. And operations and maintenance, chemicals, additives, and all that, is another $1 million over 4 years. So over 4 years, it's going to cost $3 million. So far, so good? Okay. Now, you have invented a water as a service product. It's called Cloud Filter. And you can cut 90% of the post-purchase cost in two areas. One is that because you're a cloud-based water filtration product, you save 90% of the purchase cost, you save 90% of the customization cost, and you save 90% of the operations and maintenance costs. So far, so good? So you save 90% across the board. Does that mean that you're going to price it at 90% less? No, of course not. That would not be the right pricing strategy. What should be? Now, so this is graphically how to put together O&M setup and product purchase. So that's a $3 million total cost of ownership over 4 years of the incumbent. So your problem as a startup company, as a cloud startup company, is that you're not the incumbent. But you do save 90% in two things: O&M and setup costs, more data, potential user. The company is called Textile Inc. Very creative name. The user title is Water Operations Manager, and her name is Leticia. Textile Inc. currently uses the competitor's Clean Enough Waters product called Superfilter 3.0. And Leticia is wondering whether she should upgrade to Superfilter 4.0, which would be the normal thing, or invest in Me Cleaner Water 1.0. What is the riskier thing for her? Yeah, I mean, this new startup company. That's the risky thing for her. So you're the CEO / product manager. You're getting ready for a board meeting with investors before meeting with Leticia. And you know that this guy, Tony Seba, is on the board. And he's going to ask you specifically 2 questions. One is, what's the economic value to the customer? And 2, what price are you going to charge for the product? This is your first customer. So you got to be ready. Okay? Now, so another piece of data, Cloud Filter, cost of goods sold is $100,000.
How much is competition pricing it at? What
They're pricing it at $1 million, right?
4.0?
Huh?
4.0 is?
Yes, $1 million. Plus 1 million, plus 1 million. So the competition's
Oh, it's
total
free.
cost of ownership over 4 years is $3 million. Okay? Yes.
But shouldn't it be Me Cleaner Water, not Clean Enough Water?
Um,
I mean, you are asking the new guy,
yes,
so, but Clean Enough is the incumbent.
that's right. You're right. Yeah. So Me Cleaner Water. Good point. You're Me Cleaner Water. Thank you. All right. So I showed this already. The total cost of ownership for the incumbent would be $3 million. Your product saves 90% here, 90% here, and you know that this is your cost of goods sold. So you're going to price it somewhere, right, south of 3 million and probably north of 300,000, because these are your costs over 4 years. Okay? Now, first thing to notice, what is the economic value to the customer if you price it at the very, very minimum, no profits for you? If you price it at 0 profits, then you're going to price it at $300,000. If you price it at $300,000, then the economic value to the customer, to this customer, to Leticia, is going to be what? 2.7 million. Is that clear? They're functionally identical, so you're not going to increase more revenue. You're cutting $2.7 million in cost. Question?
What about the risk for the operations manager? She could incur some consequential damages or some liability issues or whatever. So that would bring her costs far beyond the 3 million.
Thank you for that question. So, did you all hear the question? What about the risks to the operations manager? Right? Is this all? Is this all their costs? No. We have to calculate switching costs. And switching costs involve swapping out of the old infrastructure into the new infrastructure, all the training and all the, other risks. Maybe even including insurance. I mean, if your business is down for a week or whatever, we'll insure that. Does that make sense? So let's say we calculate the switching costs and it's 500,000. But that was a good point. Do not forget to include the switching costs. And if we do include that, then we're talking about an EVC of 2.2 million, assuming that, these are the costs, etc. Does that make sense? Does the EVC make sense? That's question number one. So, question.
So do you make it explicitly known to the customer that you are absorbing their switching costs when you quote them?
Are you basically, do you tell the customer that you're covering those things? Of course, you have to, right? You have to tell them, look, we're going to help you with training. The cost is going to include all these things. Training, insurance, all these things. It has to, in this case, right? Okay, so question number one, what's the EVC? $2.2 million. Question number two, what's the price? What is the price? They're gonna spend $3 million on the incumbent or spend X on you. What's the price? We know the economic value to them is 2.2 million if you price at cost. Yes?
You haven't still considered the emotional value though.
Let's say that we covered all those things, emotional and all those things in switching costs. Yeah?
$1.9 million.
$1.9 million. Where is that?
That's just splitting the EVC in half.
Oh, interesting. So you want to split the EVC in half. Okay, and comments, anyone? Yes?
Yeah,
Evan?
but I think also you can actually communicate a lot through the price. So I mean, if you feel that your technology is somewhat superior, you're in the cloud and everything, maybe you can price it higher than 3 million. Because it's
Higher than 3 million. Wow. So it's functionally identical. It's doing the same thing. So what does it mean to be superior?
it's a new technology. It's kind of
It's cooler to have a cloud.
yeah.
It's cooler, right? You can probably click on...
Revolutionary.
Yeah, it's revolutionary. You can probably click on it and it's going to tell all your Facebook friends that you're using cloud technology, right? Yes, Thomas?
I would come up with a more or less the same price, around 2 million, but I would argue differently. I would say I give you a 30% price discount on what you pay today. Because 30% is a large enough number
Right.
to turn things around.
Right, interesting. So 30% off.
Well, so this is water as a service? What
Yes.
the time value of money?
Yes?
I am assuming the incumbent is a, fixed cost up front. I don't know if that's the case, right?
Right.
As opposed to something that you pay over time and greater flexibility?
Interesting. So does flexibility and paying over time make a difference? Yeah, maybe so. But let's talk about capital costs, right? Over 4 years, and not include financing just yet. But including financing may make a difference, right? Question.
So that's just price perception, right? Cheap. If you price it very cheap, they may think this is a cheap project. It may not be applicable for a business consumer, but
No, it's not. This is not a consumer. This is a textile company, right? So but the question was, if you price it cheap, this is called signaling. And signaling is important, right? If you price it too cheap, it signals low quality, right? If you price it high, then it signals high quality. It may not be the reality, but in fact, in consumer markets, they've done tests of wine. Same wine, right? They wrap it and they put $20, $10, $5. The same wine, when the consumer sees the $20, actually tastes better. It actually does taste better. No, I'm not kidding. It actually does taste better, right? So signaling actually modifies the actual taste buds, right?
The emotional value.
Huh?
You talked about earlier, we didn't add the emotional value in here.
We didn't have the emotional value, but I added it all in switching costs. Could be negative or positive, right? But I insured against all emotional value. Because you're a startup company, it's probably more negative than positive. Okay, so many of the things that you guys said was right. Splitting the difference is probably the right thing to do. But in this case, what I would do, and that is the rule of thumb, in fact. The rule of thumb is to communicate with the customer and say, look, this is my cost. This is the value that I'm going to create for you. Let's split it. Okay? And that is the rule of thumb. And if you can communicate with the customer, if it's a business customer, it's hard to communicate this in a consumer situation, but in a business situation, that's the rule of thumb. Okay? But at the end of the day, you start with that and see what the market's going to bear. I mean, that's the truth. Question 3.
It seems honest to say, hey, here are all my cars, and this is how much it costs me. But would it be better if you said, hey, 3 million split in half, 1.5, half off for you?
That would be a way to do it. I would split the EVC, not the price.
But then you're telling them exactly how much you're giving them everything.
When you're a startup company, you don't have any customers, that's fine. Does that make sense? Yeah, you're opening up the kimono, and that's fine when you're a startup company seeking your first customer. Right? You want to be trusted. You want to communicate. You want to be open, right? Because you're asking them to take a risk on you. You want to be trustworthy. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah. Question?
I guess my only question with that is, you can always start up and go down. You can't start down and go up in price.
That's a great point. And I'm going to come back to that. Going up in price in a price negotiation is pretty much, if not difficult, it's
as the demand builds for your product, you can't ever,
you can't raise the price, right? And that's true. That is very true. But on the other hand, if your cost of goods sold is 100K and you're pricing it at 2 million, that's not a bad gross margin. Does that make sense?
You can't raise the price to that customer.
But not to that customer, yeah. But let me talk about the actual strategies in a second. I just want to go over the EVC exercise and how to price when there is a large EVC. Does this make sense so far? Okay.
Shouldn't we ask the customer what he's willing to pay rather than us go and tell him that we'll sell it to you for 2 million?
Oh, at the end of the day, so should we ask the customer what they're willing to pay? At the switching cost. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So depending on how you frame it, at the end they're paying the same thing, 1.4, but you may want to say it's 1.9 and I cover all the costs. Because later it's going to be hard to increase price. But it may not be hard to say I'm not covering the switching costs, especially in hypergrowth. Okay, so be thorough. Good questions all. Be thorough when calculating all the costs, switching costs. Be very, very thorough. Are cost savings one time? Are they recurring? All these things, you gotta cover it. And the way to do this is, of course, feel the pain. You gotta know the customer. You gotta know their costs. If you can, do a 4-year cash flow analysis. And work with them to do this, cash flow analysis and NPV and IRR and all that good stuff. Okay?
And MIRR.
And MIRR.
Really important one.
Exactly. If they like MIRR, you do MIRR, right? Those who took my finance course, you know what we're talking about, right? Okay, so pricing strategy. No? Oh, it's just another way to do IRR. Modified IRR, right? There are mathematical, discontinuities in IRRs. Huh? Subtleties, exactly, subtleties, yeah. At the end, they usually give the same answer. But some people like MIRR. All right, so let me talk about pricing strategies. So far, it's all been about value, right? So So what are the pricing strategies? I'm going to talk about two specifically. One is skimming. Skimming is start high. So in that exercise that we just did, start as high as you possibly can. Because what you want to do is achieve high margins. And the pros are that, of course, the higher the margins, the more profitability you can achieve. And it signals quality. The problems, slower market penetration, the higher the price, slower penetration. And when word gets out that this company is making 90% gross margin, what do you think is going to happen? 30 VCs are going to fund competitors, right? That's what's going to happen, if not 100. So it's going to encourage competition. So you figure out which one you are going for. And there are occasions, characteristics, when this strategy is appropriate. When there are high barriers to entry, or you can have high barriers to entry. When demand is price inelastic. Price inelastic means that if you price it at half, it's going to increase the demand by 2x, right? But there are products where even if you decrease the price, it's not going to increase demand. Example, has anyone looked at the price of salt lately? Table salt? So if table salt doubles, it's not going to do anything for demand. If it goes down by half, it's not going to do anything for demand. That's price inelastic. Does that make sense?
And that has to do with demand elasticity as well.
Yeah, of course. If you know what the demand elasticity is. And so on and so forth, right? So these are the checks that you have to go through if you want to do value, right? Pricing, skimming. Yes?
Yeah, when you do pricing, how do you know how it's going to affect the demand? You don't have anything to sell yet.
So how do you know if this thing is price elastic or inelastic?
Yeah.
That's a good question. Does anyone know?
Ask the customer.
For instance, you can ask the customer, right? You can compare yourself versus the incumbent. Is that price elastic or inelastic, right? I mean, usually new categories is where you need to do this. If you're going into an existing category, then the price has been already set by the market, right? And you're going to go, plus or minus the established pricing mechanism of the market, right? But if it's a new category, then you may want to look at existing categories and the pricing mechanisms in those. So, infrastructure software, whether it's ERP or CRM or any of these like software infrastructures, you probably want to start in value, skimming. If you're going into a small market, you probably want to skim, and so on and so forth. So there are ways for you to find out. Very few, even new categories are totally unique. It's usually, variations on an existing framework, if that makes sense. Yeah? Okay. It also has to do with your strategy. Okay? Is your strategy, your financial strategy, your corporate strategy, to maximize margins? Or is your strategy to basically gain as much market share as possible? Okay? That may well determine whether you skim or penetrate, which is the other strategy. So the strategy, the penetration strategy, is set a low price because what you want to do is maximize market share. Okay? Now, the pro is that, of course, faster market penetration. And if you price low enough, you're going to discourage competition, right? I mean, your 30 closest friends are not going to start competing companies because investors are going to be like, so you want me to invest $5 million in a market that makes 10%? Gross margin? I don't think so, right? Unless, of course, I can sell it to Facebook, but that, so you're going to discourage competition. And the problem is you're going to lose money up front. So somehow you better be able to raise cash to grow. And it's hard to raise prices. So once you set the bar at a low price, it's going to be hard to raise prices later. Okay? You have a question?
A comment rather. This is great if you have a lock-in situation or if the switching cost is too high that you discourage competition. And that way you price lower, even though you lose money up front, you know that you have long-term contracts with them or.
So lock-in, we're talking about the beginning of the life cycle, and nobody's going to have any lock-in. Does that make sense?
So they don't want a lock-in?
Well, maybe. So I think that what you're talking about is, and what I would say is, if the market has network externalities, okay, then you want to do this. Then you want to price as low as possible. If you're in an operating system market, for instance, which have externalities, then you definitely want to go here. Why? Why? Because there's going to be one winner. Right? Network effects means there's going to be one winner. The network. There's one Facebook. Okay, who's number two? Nobody. Right? Nobody. Okay, who's number two to Twitter? Game over. So if there might be network externalities, then boom, you have to do this. Okay? And all these other reasons, economies of scale, blah, blah, blah. Okay? But basically these apply when you want quick market penetration. International pricing, I'm going to talk about three things, and then we can take a quick bio break. So one thing that has happened over the last 10 years or so is that international pricing has totally changed. With the web, anybody can find out what something is priced in pretty much any market. So, search costs are low, transportation costs are low. Basically, is anyone in international transportation here? I mean, what does it cost to ship a container from Guangzhou to San Francisco? Does anyone? A container is half of this classroom. So this whole classroom is 2 containers full of, say, TVs or iPads or whatever. Does anyone know?
$5,000.
Who said 5,000? Very good. Were you gonna say that? Yeah. I mean, depending on the fuel costs, which is the biggest cost, could be as low as 2,000. Okay, but it's in that order of magnitude. So imagine how many iPads you can fit into this classroom, and it's going to cost you how many? 5,000, 10,000? So it's going to cost you 50 cents to $1 per iPad to ship it from Guangzhou to San Francisco. It's going to cost more money to ship it from the port of Oakland to Best Buy than it is to ship it from Guangzhou to the port of Oakland. Does that make sense? So in reality, international pricing, you have to think about it. Okay? Value, EVC, all those things, but it's not a simple, decision. So in general, there are 3 strategies depending on the product category. Global is one price globally. Regional, price according to regions. And multinational, one price for all. Okay? So let's look at it quickly. I'll let you go over this at home, but there are many, half a dozen reasons why you want to do one or the other. More than anything, it's going to, again, depend on your company's, on your corporate strategy. Do you want to maximize margin? Do you want to maximize market share? Okay? And in general, it has to be these maximizations, whether market or margin, is probably a global strategy. Okay? You can't skim in one country and penetrate in another. It's not going to work. Because why? Because somebody's going to pick up 1,000 iPads in one country and ship them to another country. Right? Unless that service or product does not travel well. Okay? So for instance, which products or services do not travel well? Huh?
Cars.
Cars. And who said cars? Cars. They don't travel well?
Well, I mean, the tax is very expensive.
The tax.
Yeah.
Now, what market are you talking about?
The high-end luxury car.
Okay, what countries?
Taiwan.
Taiwan is an island. Cars don't travel well, right? That's true. But what about, say, Europe? What about France? Can France, a French automaker, price Peugeot 30% higher in Paris than in, Brussels, which is 2 hours drive away? Of course not. You're going to take the train, buy a car, and go back to Belgium. Does that make sense? So it depends on the market. Does that make sense? It depends on the market, and that's a good example. Does it travel well or not? What about healthcare services? Do they travel well? They don't travel well, why not? No? Isn't it the same thing getting, transplant here and in the Philippines or Kenya?
Medical care is different from country to country.
Medical care is different. How is it different?
Who picks up the check?
Who picks up the check? That's one thing. What else is different?
Safety, like in some.
Safety! What do you mean safety? Don't you trust doctors from whatever, fill in the blanks?
Transplant in Thailand is a lot cheaper than here.
A transplant in Thailand, so why not go there?
Online.
Yeah, there you go. But it doesn't travel well, right? I mean, how many people do travel to Thailand? Exactly, right? To get healthcare,
But
right?
isn't medical travel like a booming sector in the...
Medical travel is a booming sector that probably has gone from 0.1% to 0.5% of the market, right? So, you know what I mean? But the bulk of at least this market doesn't travel, even though we have the most expensive healthcare system in the world. Okay, not the best, like a lot of people think, but the most expensive by twice, right? So, anyway, multinational pricing strategy means that each country has its own price level. Healthcare could be that, but it depends. I mean, healthcare is a big thing. Are there any things within healthcare that don't travel well? Certain procedures, certain drugs, certain whatever, right? So again, it depends on a target market and it depends on a product category. Does that make sense? So it's hard to make a blanket statement. You have to be specific to the way we started, product and use. Okay? So multinational, each country has its own price level, and this is more the case in high uncertainty products. Okay? Clinical service that may not travel well. Even though another country has good healthcare services, they may not speak English, right? So you may not be comfortable, right? So depending on the target market. So again, multinational pricing, because it's uber segmented, will give you higher margins. But the problem with this segmenting by 200 countries is what?
It's an accounting nightmare.
The high costs. I mean, you have to have an office in every country. You have to have, of course, accounting nightmare and all that stuff, right? So if you're Pfizer and Lilly, you can do it. But if you're a startup company, can you do it? Maybe not, right? Regional pricing, then you price according to regions. But you need to define regions well. So the EU may be a region. NAFTA may be a region. I don't know. Mercosur, Latin America may be a region. Okay? Now, these are not regions that you learn in high school geography. These regions have to make sense. They have to have a tradition of similar pricing for those products or services. Okay? So I'll let you read this at home. In global pricing, one price for the whole world. And this is more for low differentiation products, for a lot of digital products, games, for instance. It would be hard to discriminate between gamers in different countries. Music is hard to do, although they do it. It's going to be hard to price a song at 99 cents here and $2.99 in the UK. Slight changes are possible, but otherwise, what are people going to do? They're going to get a credit card with a US number and download stuff from the US website. Does that make sense? So you got to think about these things when you do global pricing. And what's going to happen eventually, in pretty much every technology market, is that if you start with value pricing, after a while, competition is going to come in. You're going to have to cut costs, and you have to compete against the competition. Yes?
So isn't it almost bad to value price too much, because then you're kind of doomed to low margins forever?
So
it depends on the sector.
Yeah, so it depends. So the question is, isn't it bad to value price because you're doomed? You know, what you're going to do is that even if costs per unit go down, you keep creating value on top, right? So basically, even though the per byte or per megawatt or per lumen, it goes down, you basically offer more lumens. Does that make sense? Or more megawatts or more whatever. So look at the prices for a lot of technology products, whether it's storage, television, and so on and so forth, right? I mean, a lot of these technologies go way down very fast. This is technology costs. So you need to be creating value. You need to know how to keep creating value so that you don't get immersed in a cost kind of competition. That's once you're in cost competition, it's brutal. It's a brutal place to be. Solar PV is one of those markets, and solar PV costs have gone down. The learning effects have been 22% every time the infrastructure doubles since the 70s. So this is a log chart, and it keeps going down, 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 right? That's from something like 60 megawatts, $60 per watt to less than $1 a watt since the 70s. Pretty impressive, right? And it keeps going down, keeps going down. So anyone who thinks that solar is not gonna be the choice in energy over the next 10, 20 years should look at this. This says it all, right? Let me wrap this up. The opposite of that curve is this curve, of course. When your costs go down as an exponential logarithmic curve, your demand will probably go up like this. And again, in solar PV, solar has been going up since 90, the compounded growth rate of 53%, year after year after year. So, and if you map out data storage, it's pretty much the same story. Memory, it's the same story. Lumens, it's the same story. Communication is the same story, right? So many technology markets behave like this. At the end of the day, we have to do that, but it's best to go with data. It's best to say, look, these are my costs. I know these are your costs. This is the difference. Can we split it, right? I mean, I know this is risky for you, blah, blah, blah. Let's split it and boom,
Or
right?
should we not make them feel their pain and then show our perceived value and then ask them?
Before you do this, you have to feel the pain. You cannot do this without feeling the pain, right? Does that make sense? That's the first thing that you do. Good point. Last question, because I gotta move on.
So the flip side to being trustworthy is if they know that you have $1 million to make off of them
Yeah.
just by splitting the EVC,
Yeah.
they want to negotiate further down with you. You're not going to get the 1 million.
Maybe. I mean, you know, companies, there are companies, especially here in Silicon Valley. I mean, you go to a Cisco system, they know this, they're going to say, look, you're the first customer, you need me more than I need you, right? And the answer to that is move on, right, to another customer who values your product. If you did your segmentation and targeting right, and you know what the pain is, then you're going to find a customer who is willing to pay. Then in that case, Cisco is not your best target customer. Does that make sense? Yes.
One last comment on that. Yeah, actually, if you split the difference here, then the price to the operator